Good evening. Welcome to the California State Military Museum. On behalf of the Adjutant General, Major General Bill Wade, we welcome you here to our fourth book signing and lecture on military history. Tonight we have Lieutenant Commander Ted Robinson, who will be discussing PT boat warfare and the rescue of John F. Kennedy. Again, this is our fourth event. The books from the two previous book signings, we have signed copies of Ride the Thunder by Rich Bodkin and Once a Marine by Nick Popadich, available in the bookstore. If you'd like to find out more about events here at the California State Military Museum, you can go to www.militarymuseum.org, and at the top is a place where you can sign up for our email newsletters. Our guest speaker tonight is Commander Ted Robinson, United States Navy retired. Ted grew up in New York City, graduated with honors from Duke University, and has been the president of the Northern California Duke Alumni Association. He is married to Carolyn Robinson from Newport, Rhode Island, whose father did interior decorating work for the Jackie Kennedy's home and Doris Duke's home. After World War II, Ted and Lynn moved to California, where Ted worked in various management jobs for Pacific Telephone Company for 30 years, including planning engineer for Northern California, regional supervisor for public relations, executive speechwriter, and director of the Management Speakers Bureau. Retiring in 1982, Ted volunteered to work for Isla Collins, the president of the Sacramento Board of Supervisors, as the Sacramento County Park Commissioner, which he still holds today. In 2001, the Board of Supervisors proclaimed Ted and his wife community treasures and named a grove of trees after them in Mather Park. During World War II, Ted was a PT boat skipper and took part in the rescue of John F. Kennedy and later became his tent mate. He has now written a book titled Water in My Veins, which is selling here after the presentation. And you also commanded a LST, which last night we discussed is another acronym for Large Slow Target. At this time, I'd like to turn the mic over to Lieutenant Commander Ted Robinson.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, that was an interesting experience going from the smallest, most highly maneuverable, fastest boat in the United States Navy, a PT boat, to an LST, which instead of being about 80 feet long was bigger than a football field, 350 feet long, and had the top speed of 11 knots, which was PT boat would go about 50 knots, and LST was the least maneuverable. But some of my greatest experiences in the Navy was as captain of an LST. I think at one time I was the youngest captain of an LST in the United States Navy. And one of the things in my book, while everybody features the Kennedy portion because he was a celebrity, I think my chapters of some of the things that happened to me at Okinawa as captain of an LST were more exciting. At least the movie industry thinks so. There is a movie looking into that. And when they talked about me working for the Park Commission, I'm very pleased to have the husband of our director of parks, John Baker's here. Janet, who is the director, is at a park meeting, and I am a park commissioner, and I also have in my audience tonight, I'm pleased to say, Linda Orlick, who got me involved in parks because I became, when I retired in 1982, I wanted to do something for parks because as a poor kid in Flushing, I grew up in the New York City park system. And I thought if I ever amounted to anything, I'd do something for parks. And I was asked to be Public Relations Director of the Sacramento Tree Foundation. And in my audience is Linda Orlick, who is president of the Tree Foundation. And that all led to me becoming eventually a park commissioner. Linda Orlick was also responsible, I might say, to the fact that my wife and I were made community treasures for all the work we've done for a lot of things, and one of them is parks. And she arranged all that with Isla Collins, who was at that time my boss. She was president of the Board of Supervisors. So tonight, though, we're going to talk about Jack Kennedy. And Jack Kennedy wrote a book, as you know, Profiles in Courage. And there have been 7 Mommy Dearest books written by people who were never in World War II, never in the Navy, never in PT boats. One of them so young that he wasn't even alive when Jack Kennedy was assassinated, who seemed to know about everything that happened out there that fateful night of August 1st, 1943, when Jack lost his boat. His boat was rammed. And another reason, other than the fact that Linda talked me into writing the book for my children, and my wife encouraged this also, another reason I wrote the book was I was on the History Channel in 2001. They had hired a company from some kind of a schlock outfit that came out and interviewed me for 4 hours. They interviewed Paul Fay, who was Jack Kennedy's best friend, who was also in PT boats, who he made Undersecretary of Navy, and Dick Keresy, who is another PT boat skipper. All 3 of us were out that night when Jack was rammed. We knew the conditions, we knew what happened, and we gave them 4 hours of testimony each, or a total of 12 hours between the 3 of us. And they cut us down to 10 minutes out of a 2-hour show and filled the rest of it with 7 Mommy Dearest books, one of them so dangerous that they believe today he might do something to the Kennedys. And that I felt then I had to write a book to straighten out the record, because I found the History Channel had made DVDs of the speech in which they had cut us down, cutting me down to part sentences. To give an example, I said, you don't win an award in the United States Navy for losing your boat. But I went on to say, and I explained the conditions which I'm going to explain tonight, it could have happened to any of us. They cut all the rest of that sentence out. This was disgraceful, and I'm here to see anybody who watches this show or anybody in the audience to see what really happened that fateful night. To do so, we have to go back to August 1st, 1943, and I always look at my audience, many of whom are my friends, and let them begin to think, where were they on August 1st, 1943? Little Linda Orlick wasn't even born yet, and so was a few other people in this room, but many of them are nearer my age, so they can figure out where they were. But I was on August 1st, 1943, I was in the Guadalcanal campaign, and I was skipper of PT118. Now, PT118 had a very fine record. We won not 1, but 2 Silver Stars. Our squadron commander won the medal, the Navy Cross, and so we had a great record, and we were out there, and so was the 109. The 109 was originally a Squadron 5 boat, but we had very heavy casualties, and so when Jack came out there about 3 months after I came out there, he took over as skipper of PT109. The skipper of 109, the original skipper, is still alive, and I met him once up in Oregon, and I said to him, you know, I have a little trouble convincing people that are in World War II because I'm very lucky to look very young, which was a great disadvantage when I was a kid, but now it's a great advantage. And I said, I have trouble. People say, well, you couldn't have been old enough to be, and I'm 90 now, but you couldn't have been old enough to be in World War II. Well, I was, and so I met his first skipper, and his first skipper said, you think you have problems. When people ask me what I did in World War II, and I have to say I was on PT109, everybody said, sure you were, what? And, you know, so he has problems, too. Okay, we're going back to August 1st, 1943. And actually, my boat was under repair at the time. I had a number of bullet holes in my boat, for one thing. We had a lot of friendly fire. I get such a kick when the press gets all excited. Oh, friendly fire, this is terrible. If anybody in this room or anybody in this audience or anybody on TV that watches this thing has really been in combat, they know that there's lots of friendly fire. Everybody's scared, everybody's nervous, and in our case, everything we did was at night, in the darkness of the night. We could not move in the daytime, PT boats. We hid our PT boats we hid in native villages, and we hid our PT boats in the swamps, because the Japanese had 22 airfields within 100 miles, and we had one, Henderson Field, that we had just captured. And so they controlled the air, they controlled the sea. As you know, in those early days, most of our Pacific Fleet had been sunk, and what we had left of the Pacific Fleet that would come up once a month, it seemed like they immediately got sunk by a superior Japanese surface division force. The Japanese long-lance torpedoes, incidentally, were absolutely wonderful. The torpedoes we were using were from World War I. They were 30 years old. And anybody who really knows Navy history knows that the commanding officer of our torpedo section of the United States Navy was court-martialed. Incidentally, they were located in Newport, Rhode Island, where my wife is from. And every time my lovely wife of 63 years, and I have an argument, she had once worked for the torpedo group, and I say, see, you made those lousy torpedoes we had to put up with. Is that right, Lynn? Okay. So anyway, on August 1st, 1943, my boat was damaged with friendly fire and some other problems, so they sent me back up the line. Now, let me show a couple of pictures here, and we're going to see if this thing works, because I have a lovely lady here that set this all up for me. Yes, there is the native village. Now, that looks beautiful to you, and it was beautiful. That was the native village we lived in, and we lived with the natives, and it looks like paradise, but I got to keep in mind, this is hidden over behind Tulagi, 60 miles away from Guadalcanal, and we lived in this village. And then if we look here, that's my exact residence. We called it Hog Wallow. It was a native shack. And if the thing you really have to watch on this thing, and see if I can run this. Oh, yes, I have. Oh, look at this. I'm making this work. This is my native canoe. You can hardly see it, but I traded my machete for a native canoe, because they all call me Safari Robinson, because I really appreciated the beauty of the South Pacific, and I wanted a native canoe that I could paddle up streams and all, and look at the beauty. It got kind of dangerous at times. All I had was my .45, and I could have run into a Japanese straggler, something, but I only did that once, and that's a part of my book, incidentally, that incident. And so I would paddle around that. And during the day, see, we operated entirely at night, so during the day, we would bring our boats in at daylight, and we'd have to first refuel them for tomorrow night, rearm the guns, get them ready, and then try and catch some sleep. And then in the afternoon, when some of the men would wake up and ready to go out that night, they would play poker. Well, if you read my book, I was so poor. In fact, the title of my book is, the subtitle is The Pauper Who Saved the President. I was so poor, I was flabbergasted that these fellow officers of mine were betting thousands of dollars on poker games, which $1,000 to us was more than 10 times our total income when I was in the Depression. So I couldn't take part in that kind of thing. It seemed wrong to me. But we actually hid our boats in the swamps. And here is a PT boat. You'll notice, I don't know how well the color will show up on this, maybe not too well. But we originally brought them out in light navy gray. Well, that made them excellent targets at night. So we had to repaint them camouflaged in dark green and black. Green because we were hidden them, as you see, under palm trees and stuff during the day and black because we operate at night. This is a PT boat getting underway in that situation. And so when we got to talk about Jack Kennedy, you have to figure out the situation he and I lived in. First of all, when I first arrived in Guadalcanal, our squadron came right up the channel in broad daylight, and a Navy Hellcat from Henderson Field flew out, and they blinked a message to us. And I thought this message would be, "Welcome to our war." And instead, it said, "For God's sakes, run for cover." And I thought, my goodness, the great American fleet, we're supposed to run for cover. And I took my boat over to the where they told me our base was, and I expected big cranes and dry docks and piers. Instead, it was a native village. And then when we arrived, they were leading down. Everything in the military is alphabetical. And if your name is Robinson, which mine was, you spend your whole time in midshipman school and PT school looking at the back of the neck of somebody named Richards, Robinson Richards. And Dick Richards, who was skipper of another boat, the 116 boat, had gone up 2 weeks before me, and they were leading him down to the pier, and he didn't know who I was. He was out of his mind. His boat had been blown to bits. He had tried to hold up his machinist mate while the sharks, of course, which are very dangerous at night in those South Pacific warm waters, tore his machinist mate to pieces. And so he went Section 8. He only lasted 2 weeks. I, however, lasted for 8 weeks. After 8 weeks I was there, my boat was hit, and everybody on my boat and for my original crew was killed and wounded, but 3 of us, including my first skipper, who has his head blown off. So I got to be skipper real fast. I started off as an executive officer of a PT. Incidentally, that's because 60% of our 60% of our PT officers were Annapolis graduates. They were always initially the skipper of the boat, which they should be, and us 90-day wonders, who they try to make us officers and gentlemen in 3 months. My wife said that they succeeded in the first part with me, but not the second part about being a gentleman. But at any rate, so I got to be a skipper real early. But then they eventually put a full lieutenant in charge of me, in charge of the 118, and I went back to executive officer. And he lasted two missions, and he decided he didn't want to get into that kind of work. And you're soon going to find out the kind of work we did. It was pretty deadly. So he backed off, and I became skipper again. In fact, I became skipper a number of times, and we did so through injuries and so on. But anyway, Jack Kennedy arrived 3 months later. He arrived on April 5th, 1943. And when he arrived, the Japanese sent down 195 planes. And we were able to send up 8 planes to try to stop them. And the reason they sent down that many planes was not because they knew Jack someday would be President of the United States, but because the LST that brought him in arrived in broad daylight, which was unheard of. And so the Japanese had a live target in daylight, and that's, of course, why we never went out. You know, every one of them missed that LST, and the LST was able to shoot down one of those zeros. So I'm real proud of that when I eventually became a PT boat's LST captain later in the war. Okay, well, when Jack arrived, they gave him the PT109, and we began to operate together. And so the time I'm going to talk about, we had finally captured Guadalcanal thanks to our brave Marines. There's a couple of Marines in this audience, and I can tell you right now, as far as I'm concerned, the Marines are the finest fighting force in the world, in my opinion. If you recall, in World War II, the Japanese had swept through China, In no time, they took the Philippines in weeks. They took Vietnam in about 2 weeks. We've been over there. We were over there for 8 years and never took it. They took Singapore. The British surrendered right away. They took Indonesia. They took that whole area until they ran up against the 1st Marine Division. And if you really know your history, the big ship Navy put those Marines ashore and then abandoned them for 2.5 months. Not purposely, but our big ship Navy could not get back in without being immediately destroyed, and those Marines lived without reinforcements of troops, without medicine, without ammunition, and they never surrendered. The Japanese, I'm supposed to say now, ran into the real fighters of the world. But we, thanks to those Marines and thanks to the Army troops, which I have great admiration for, our land forces finally took Guadalcanal. And our next objective was to get one more airfield. So instead of the Japanese having 21 and we having only one, we would have 2 and they would only have 20. So our objective was to take Munda Airstrip, which was here on New Georgia Island, right here. The Japanese had 60,000 troops on New Georgia. They had 40,000 on Colombagara, 22,500 on Vella La Vella. They had a big seaplane base on Choiseul. You'll find it later on. 1,500 on Gizo. They had 100,000 troops in this area. So we put the Marines and the Army ashore at Munda, and they were desperately fighting to capture Munda. Well, here's what happened. The way you win wars, if any of you are not military, and most of my audience today is military, is you cut off the enemy supply line. So they can't get reinforcements. They can't get ammunition. And the enemy supply line, the Japanese supply line, came from Rabaul, their great bastion to the north, which incidentally we never took in World War II. We never took their 2 major bastions in the South Pacific, Truk and Rabaul. They were far too strong. We just bypassed and let them starve to death. But at any rate, they would come down from Rabaul with destroyers. They would come either through Blackett Strait, this was about 5 to 8 miles wide, to reinforce their troops here, or they came down through Kula Gulf to reinforce it. And there was another Navy base over here at Leva Harbor, where I was later stationed, that would patrol this area. But our base, which we've set up down here on Lambari Island off Rendover, we would come up north here, and we would come through Ferguson Passage, and we would literally lay a picket line of PT boats across Blackett Strait in order to stop the Japanese. Now, the night of August 1st, 1943, we got word and let me tell you how we got our intelligence out there. The bravest men in the world, in my opinion, were the Coast Watchers. The Coast Watchers were Brits, or they were Kiwis from New Zealand, or they were Aussies from Australia, that had been the plantation managers on these islands before World War II. Because the Solomon Islands were owned by the British, and these islands were covered with palm trees, and Oliva Brothers soap in every one of these islands had got from the coconut oil the beautiful palm olive soap that Elizabeth Leidy, with her beautiful complexion, or Arlene over here, now used to take their baths. And so we asked the British and Aussies to come back alone. And we put them ashore, either submarines or PT boats, put them ashore alone at night. I remember when I put ashore at Colombagara, we put him ashore in a little rubber Avon raft, and he handed me a letter. He said, try and get this back to the little woman. It was always his last letter that he ever wrote, because they had a life expectancy of 4 months before the Japanese put radio direction finders on them and finally murdered them, tortured them to death. So at any rate, we got word from our Coast Watchers the Japanese were sending down 5 heavy destroyers, loaded with 900 troops for a major reinforcement of Munda because our Marines were beginning to win. And this was their last major effort. Well, my boat, as I say, was damaged. So I went up the line, up to our base there on Lambari Island, and I arrived on another PT boat. And right after I arrived on that PT boat, I have to first show you that why everything is at night. You see, we're dark and in the night, so that's our entire operations were at night. But that's it. This is an idea. Now, this is the most important picture in this whole show. This is exactly the life we led. We led in total darkness. How many of you have been out at night on the water in the dark? How many? This little girl over here has, and okay, you have. Well, you know, this is before no running lights, no lighthouses, reefs all around, thousands of enemy troops around, and then there would be flares dropped or gunfire that would blind you. This is key to knowing what happened to Kennedy. It was a very exhausting situation. Well, anyway, I arrived on this boat. Now, it's hard to see this boat because it's blown to bits, and it was blown to bits 2 minutes after I got off it. I came up on this boat, and this boat what happened, I was very lucky. We arrived and we blinked ashore to actually Lambari Island, which is shown in the background here. And we blinked ashore to send a small boat out to pick us up and move us to the beach. And they blinked it back from the shore. We're under air attack. We can't do it right now. And lucky there was some big fat commander that ran a bunch of stripes like I now do, but I didn't then. And he said, "This is Commander so-and-so, you send that damn boat out here." And they did, and I got on it, and 2 minutes after we got away from the boat we came in on, that's what happened to it. They not only destroyed that boat, they blew up the 117 boat, which is my other sister boat. And everybody was killed on both of those. And I survived again by a hair. Incidentally, when my boat was blown apart back in Guadalcanal and everybody was killed, I was hit in the helmet with shrapnel, and had I been any taller, I would have been dead. All the time I was in college and high school, I used to complain about these little girls that I was in love with or thought I was, said, "Oh, well, he's 6 foot tall, and you're only a little guy." Well, I never complained since, I can tell you. But at any rate, I arrived on that boat, and I reported to Branningham. Now, Hank Branningham was executive officer of Squadron 5. At that time, Squadron 6 had been so decimated, we eventually lost, of our 12 boats, we lost all but 2. Eventually, we lost mine. There's a terrific chapter in my book of how but mine was lost. I ended up on the same reef with the Japanese we were just attacking, so close that we could hear them talk. But they were on an island. They were way up here. I was way up here 70 miles behind enemy lines, and they had 22,000 troops on Vela La Vela, and all they had to do was wade ashore. And so how we got out of that mess, you have to read the book. And I'm looking at the only guy in the whole audience that doesn't already own a book, because most of these are close friends of mine that have already bought the book. So Lynn, forget selling the book tonight. You're not going to sell many tonight. But anyway, I reported to Hank Branningham. Now, Hank Branningham was a great guy. He had been the executive officer of the PT boat that got MacArthur out of the Philippines. And the squadron commander of that boat was Buckley, who became the most decorated man in the United States Navy. And a lot of us Navy men think she should have left MacArthur in the Philippines, but that's just the Navy viewpoint. But at any rate, so Branningham was a great guy, and Branningham didn't know exactly what to do with me. I had been sent up there because my skipper, Percy, had said, as long as my boat is our boat, the 118, is damaged, we'll take that back to the floating dry dock, back in Tulagi, get it fixed, and you go up there and figure out what's happening up there so we will know when we bring the 118 up. Well, Buckley said to me, he said, "Son, what are you doing tonight?" And I said, "Well, anything you say, sir." I mean, I was a little ensign at the time, and he said, "Well, I'll tell you what. We're going out on a major attack against 5 destroyers, and I'm in charge of the entire attack. Do you know anything about radar?" We had just gotten radar on our PT boats, and we only had them on a very few boats. And I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "All right, I'm going to make you, you've been out here longer than I have." I had been out there longer than he. He said, "I want you to be the radar officer of the entire attack." I might add, real quickly before I forget it, that a number of those 7 Mommy Dearest book writers say that the radar officer didn't know what the hell he was doing. Well, I was the radar officer. So I can tell you I knew what I was doing. I'll explain why in a minute. Anyway, what we would design, we got 15 boats underway, PT boats. 15 of them. We would come north. Jack was in the 109. I was with Branningham on the lead boat in attack, which that night was the 159 boat. And we went up here, and we had to get through here, through Ferguson Passage. Now, this looks wide on this map. What it doesn't show is there's reefs way out here, so the actual entrance is only a mile wide to get through here. Everything else is coral reefs. We had to go through there. Now, the Japanese float planes, which were amphibious planes, and they used those because they could maintain airspeed at only 80 knots. They could almost hover over us. And one of our big problems with these jets we have today, in my opinion, in Iraq and Afghanistan, they go so damn fast they miss the target. But the old Japanese float planes would go very slowly, and they would come down from Choiseul, and they would, knowing we had to go through this narrow passage, they would drop flare after flare. They would be on parachutes, the flares, so they came down slowly. Because these planes had to discover us and destroy us before we could make our attacks, or they literally had to go back and commit hara-kiri. Hey, now, that's a very motivational way. If any of my audience are having trouble with their employees, try that. You'll see they work real hard if they have to fall on their own swords. So, at any rate, they would send these out, and so to get through here, we had to pay a terrible price of admission. And of our 15 boats, 3 of them never made it. They didn't get through. Now, these flares came down very slowly, and I always mention, because my wife's here, that remember, you ladies know that they didn't discover, DuPont didn't discover nylon till after World War II. And all their little dighties were made out of silk. Well, we couldn't get silk in World War II. So these Japanese parachutes were beautiful silk, and my wife, to this day, is wearing a pair of Japanese silk parachute panties. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. But anyway, we had a certain way to do this. We would either get right under the flare, because if you got right under the flare, the flare blinded the planes too. And when the flare went down, you'd grab the parachute, or you would stay outside the flare, and you would see the pilots just about 3 times as high as this ceiling, just looking for you, and you would dash through, and they would bank and come and try to strafe you and bomb you. And we had certain maneuvers we had learned. We'd go like hell, and just when we knew they were about to bomb, we would stop short, and they would overfly us, and then we'd try to shoot them down. It was kind of a little game. Well, we got 12 of the 15 boats through that night, and we were supposed to put them in groups of 4. We were the inboard boat, the furthest north on the 159, with the squadron commander, Branningham, and me as radar officer here. And then Jack was going to be down in this area in the 109 with another 4 boats, another 4 boats. Well, what really happened, we would get separated going through here, and then we couldn't find each other in the darkness of the night. Remember my original picture of what the darkness of the night looked like. And so you got lost immediately. It was hard to even get together with other PT boats in the darkness. But at any rate, we were waiting, and sure enough, at 11 o'clock, the radar officer who was me. And incidentally, Jack Kennedy did not have radar. Only 2 other boats had radar, just 3 out of the 12 boats. I picked up the pips. Now, I had been out there enough to know that a pip that size on your radar screen moving that fast had to be a destroyer. All the guys back in the States in some hotel room in Brooklyn or Miami Beach, and I mention those particularly, or Hollywood, where those people are all from, they all write that the radar officer didn't know what he was doing. Well, I knew damn well what I was doing. And so our squadron commander immediately radioed that we had picked up the target. Now, another one of these Monomy Dearest books say, oh, that we never radioed to the rest of the boats what was happening. Well, we did, but we had another problem. Our regular Navy frequency was, of course, tuned in by the Japanese. And every Japanese group had at least some graduate from usually Berkeley that had gone, Japanese had gone to Berkeley. I say that because I went to Duke, and Berkeley has a reputation with us military guys. It's not very good, even though Al Leidy over here was vice president of Berkeley, apparently. But at any rate, we radioed to the rest of the boats, but we had to use our Army walkie-talkies because they weren't tuned into that frequency. And the Army walkie-talkies were very sensitive to a change in temperature. We would tune them up back here in the daylight, where in daytime when it was 120 degrees in the shade and no shade, and then we would try to transmit at 70 degrees in the cool air at night. And so we radioed to the rest of the boats on walkie-talkies, but they probably didn't get the message. But you'll soon find out what in the hell difference it meant, because what happened next, you sure as hell knew something was happening. So what happened was we prepared to make our attack. Now, the way you make an attack in a PT boat, you don't do like the movies. And yes, I have been on John Wayne's yacht with John Wayne, and I'm probably the only guy in history where I asked John Wayne for his autograph, and he said, no, I'm just a movie guy. He said, I want yours. And I'm very flattered at that. I spent a whole afternoon on his yacht once, which is incidentally a retired Navy minesweeper down in Balboa Island, Newport Beach, where we had a summer place. But at any rate, we didn't go in high speed because, of course, the South Pacific waters were very fluorescent. And at night, they made a path right up your stern that the Japanese could easily see. So we sneaked in. And we sneaked in, and the next thing I'm telling you is the most important thing in this whole story. We sneaked in with our mufflers closed, the most important thing in the world to what's going to happen next. The reason we closed our overwater mufflers is we had 3 1,500 horsepower engines, almost 6,000 horsepower. The only weight we had was the only metal we had on the boat was our 3 packet engines. We had our torpedoes and we had our guns. And yet we had all that horsepower. Well, you could hear them 25 miles away if your mufflers were open. And there were 40,000 Japanese here, 12,500 here. So we closed our mufflers and we would sneak in. And we had a very primitive sight that was set for 38 knots because we knew those Japanese destroyers were going as fast as they could, which was about 38 knots. And they were going fast because they knew exactly when and where we would attack. They knew we had to get them in this narrow. If you try to get them up here, you'd lose them at sea. If you try to get them down here, it was too late. So they knew we would be here. And so they would be going like hell, really fast. Well, I picked up not 5 pips, I picked up 4. Luckily, one of the 5 had broken down, Japanese destroyers. So we sneaked in very carefully, very slowly, with our mufflers closed. So, and the reason, incidentally, believe it or not, we were so noisy, even the planes could hear our mufflers over their own engines. So that was very important. So I also got a say something else right now. All these books that are written about us Kennedy being a bum, you got to think of the situation we're in. One, we had casualties almost every night, so there was fear. Secondly, we almost all, except me, had malaria. Every PT boat, the guy that, when we came back to States, I was the only one to pass the physical. I was the only one that didn't have malaria. They had yellow jaundice, they had dysentery, and they had something called purple Jesus, which ladies in the audience I won't explain. Except you sweat a lot when it's a lot of 120 degrees in the shade, and you live right on the equator, which this area was in. So we would sneak in. We never flew the American flag. We never wore our uniforms because we knew we'd be tortured to death by the Japanese. So we sneaked in very carefully. And then when the Japanese finally picked us up, and they picked us up real early, because remember the Japanese had a little guy way up in the crow's nest, 100 feet off the surface of the Earth. What was it, Physics 101, that you learned that your sight across the horizon is a direct proportion to your height off the... Remember, Jack Kennedy was looking from 5 feet high off the deck of a PT boat, and the Japanese were looking from 100 feet high because he had no radar. All the rest, none of the boats other than 3 of us had radar. So they picked us up very early, and the minute they picked us up, their searchlights would come on. Now, all these searchlights are over here in the Roseville Auto Mall right now, selling Toyotas, selling Hondas, all the Japanese cars you arrived in today. And so once they came on, that was a horrible feeling. The thing it reminded me of is when I went to Duke University, I had this little Ford convertible rumble seat, 1934. And I had this little southern gal by the name of Jenny Ray. And there's a whole chapter in this book about Jenny Ray. In fact, Jenny's still alive, and I stay in contact with her. She's in a nursing home in Roanoke, Virginia. Lovely girl. She was my college girlfriend. And little Jenny Ray would be in that rumble seat, and the campus cop would come along Lover's Lane and put that big flashlight in the window. Oh, God. I mean, well, that's what it reminded. I always thought of that when those big Japanese flashlights came on. You feel so naked. Anyway, those flashlights would come on, and the minute they came on, how many of you have been over to the California State Fair here at Cal Expo during the fair where they have that beautiful fountain in the middle and there's lights on it? Well, it would be like, it was real pretty because it'd be these big searchlights and there'd be all these beautiful fountains all around you. Well, what the hell they were was every one of these Japanese ships had 4, 2 forward, 3 aft, 5 triple 4.7, similar to 5-inch cannons. They were all firing at you. So you had all these 5-inch shells coming at you and exploding all around you. You had all their pom-pom guns, all their anti-aircraft guns, and 900 troops lying shoulder to shoulder, all trying to kill you. And they all were pointing to starboard because they knew we couldn't get inside them, other their shore batteries would get us, and even their mortars. And they had wonderful charts. The Japanese had beautiful charts. We were looking at British Admiralty charts, some of them from the 1800s. I remember one of them said, this island believed to be 3 miles due west of where plotted on the chart. So that's the kind of charts we were dealing with. And they had the latest things. They had planned this all before World War II. So we could never get inside them. And the next key thing I want you to think about is that Kolamagara was a large mountainous island. So the Japanese were against the darkness while we were silhouetted against the open sea. Very important disadvantage. If you really know about night fighting, that's a terrible disadvantage. So we had to attack silhouetted, and that's why they picked us up so early. So anyway, this gunfire would start. Now, once the gunfire started, we would then and only then open our mufflers because we were committed. There was so much noise and searchlights and everything by then. And we couldn't speed up over 6 knots because if we went over 6 knots with our mufflers closed, the boat would stall because all that carbon monoxide and all would be of idling for hours would be backed up in those engines. So then we opened our mufflers, we pushed our throttles forward, and we literally closed in until our guts ran out. We closed in to 1,400 yards. That's 14 football fields. Now, that sounds like a long ways, but a broadside to 4 destroyers, all firing everything they got on you. It's a very uncomfortable situation. And I can tell you there was water all over our deck from explosions right next to us. The boat was blown sideways, back and forth. Great way to make a living. And the Japanese could never figure out. They called us devil boats. They thought we were crazy how we would close in on them. Well, we closed into 1,400 yards, and the 157 boat closed in next to us. 2 of us made the attack together. We fired all 4 torpedoes. The 157 only, for some reason, fired 2 of those. Now, once we fired our torpedoes, we would make a very tight turn. How many in you, this audience, are water skiers with speedboats and so on? You know, even there's a water skier. This kid's been on rafts and everything else. She's the one that got us coming down the Atlantic through the American River through the rapids. Linda did. But anyway, she's a great gal. But anyway, we got in there and we would make a tight turn. And when you make a tight turn, even a high-speed boat mushes down and almost stops, in those tight turns. And that's when you're going to die. And that's when you're going to die. And then once you got through that turn, you picked up speed because those torpedoes weighed 1.5 tons each, and we had fired all 4. And I have some great mathematicians in this audience that can multiply. Here's a recent college girl. 1.5 tons times 4 is 6 tons. And so we had lost 6 tons in weight, and we then had a smoke screen generator on the stern. This PT model is so small I should have brought the big one, but on the stern, and we would lay white smoke. Now, white smoke is very effective against searchlights. How many of you have been at a 4th of July block party and you've had the little fireworks going off, and pretty soon it gets so smoky you can't see across the street? Well, that's white smoke. And we would then pick up speed because we'd lost that weight, and we would weave at high speed and try to get out alive. Now, the thing, however, that really saved us is once we made our turn, the Japanese knew our torpedoes were speeding towards them. And they, in turn, had to take a defensive maneuver. And they always did the same thing. They always turned into us for 2 reasons: to expose only their narrow bows rather than the whole broadside of the ship, and second, to ram us. That was standard tactics, understandably so. They wanted to let us lose our little lives. And so they would go, they would do that. Now, when I say the Japanese knew our torpedoes were speeding towards them, we know otherwise. We were using World War I torpedoes, 30 years old. Even the Italian Navy had new electric torpedoes. We had these old air flash torpedoes. If they ever got to the target, it was a miracle. They would have dry runs, hot runs. They were set for 12 feet. Furthermore, they went only 28 knots, and by that time, we were doing, before we made our turn, we were doing about 40. And hey, they're right behind us. We could have gotten torpedoed by our own goddamn torpedoes. That night, those 12 boats fired 25 torpedoes at those 4 destroyers. And I think we killed maybe 1 land crab, I think we stirred up a little coral reef there someplace. We never hit a goddamn thing. But it wasn't because we didn't try. And this happened over and over. And it was real discouraging with the lives we lost to fighting with that kind of equipment. But anyway, we got out, and we went at high speed, and we stopped over here, and the 157 came over with us. And as we were radioing back to the base, what do you want us to do now? And they said, if you fired all 4 torpedoes, come home. And just about the time we were trying to decide whether to go the short way home and face these float plane players again, or the long way home, which was safer but longer, we were trying to decide which to go when we saw a huge explosion right about where PT109 was. You know how many gallons of gasoline we carried? We carried 3,000 gallons of high-octane gas. How many have you seen an automobile accident where the gas tank is exploded? I mean, you know, it's deadly. It's terrible. Imagine what 3,000 looks like. Well, you know, that's almost as much as your SUV now carries that you all buy from the Japanese. But anyway, so we saw this big explosion, and we thought that Kennedy or one of the boats lower down had got a hit on the magazine, the engine room of the destroyers. And we thought, man, somebody got him, thank God. And we went home, and the next morning, Jack Kennedy and the 109 was missing. Now, the boat nearest to 109 in that attack was PT162. And the radiomen in PT162 lived about 20 blocks from us, right here in Sacramento, up until about 4 years ago when John O'Neill was his name and he died. Otherwise, he would be here to back up exactly what I'm going to tell you. But John is gone. Most everybody I know is gone at my age. But at any rate, he came back the next day and he said, we were so close to the 109 when they were hit that some of the flaming gasoline came over on our deck. And the second Japanese destroyer tried to ram us and just missed. He said nobody could have survived that explosion, that accident. And so the next day, we sent the Air Force. How many Air Force guys in here? No Air Force? I usually ask them, one over here? Okay, how high are those planes back there in the 43? How high could they fly? What else? 10,000 feet? How many? Probably 20,000. 20,000. We sent an airplane out, and I'm sure he was going 20,000 feet high because he had all these airfields. At that time, we're down to 21 of them. And so he searched, and he saw the hull of PT 109 floating, but he said there were no survivors. That was an inaccurate report. You don't see little men in the water from that altitude. So we had a funeral, but we had funerals every day, and this was for Jack Kennedy, and it was long before he had the big one back in Washington, D.C. with the caissons and all that stuff. He was just another guy, and he was gone, and so was his crew. And so we figured that. And then a week later, I was standing at the front door of the operations hut of our base back here on Lambari Island. Now, everything we had on Lambari was over the ground. Everything was underground, everything underground. Everything above ground was missing because the Japanese bombed us every night. If we got a night off to stay home, we were bombed anyway. Every night we were bombed. And we used to have little slit trenches next to our tents that we were supposed to jump in. We finally said, to hell with it. Let God decide who goes. And at any rate, so we got back here to the base and we had a funeral and thought that was the end of it. But I was standing at the underground entrance, the sandbag entrance of our communications hut. We had operating room underground to operate for our doctors to operate on us. And a Melanesian native showed up. And here, I'm back here. This beautiful girl back here has given me this thing to show, and we'll show you this picture. Let's see how this comes. Yes, right on, Julia. Where are you? Not these exact natives, but two natives. These are Melanesian natives in a little canoe, just like that, what I used to have, paddled up, and they had paddled 30 miles, all the way from up here, all the way from up here, all the way down here, more than 30 miles actually, and brought a coconut, which is the most famous coconut in the whole freaking world. And he handed it to me. And on it, it said, 11 still alive, send help. And it was from Jack Kennedy. He had scrawled something on a coconut. That coconut was on his desk when he was president of the White House for years. But at any rate, I brought the coconut. I talked to the natives, and the natives could speak Pidgin English. The Solomon Islands were owned by the British, so they'd say, oh, him long guy. You could figure out what they were saying. And he told me that Jack had gotten across here somehow, and he was some little islands in here, right off Ferguson Passage. And he brought this message. And I handed it to the commanding officer, Branningham again. And Branningham looked at this, and we radioed to the Coast Watcher in Coolangatta. And the Coast Watcher in Coolangatta put a British Enfield rifle, some food, and some water in a native canoe with some natives, and they paddled. No white people, because the Japanese were over us all night. And if they just saw a couple of black guys paddling, they wouldn't do anything. But if they saw an American in there, God help us. But they paddled over here and brought Jack the first food and water they had had. Meanwhile, some other natives had run into Lenny Tom, who was his executive officer. Lenny Tom was the executive officer of PT109. Lenny Tom, incidentally, was an all-American football player from Ohio State. That was the kind of guys we had in PT boats. And he, of course, went back to the States and got killed in an auto accident, probably by a Toyota. But at any rate, he was back here, and some of the natives saw him. But he was so sunburned from the sun and so burned from the burns of the explosion that the natives thought he was Japanese because he looked brown. And then the natives told me later, after we picked him up, they said, him look brown like Japo guy, but him too, long fella boy, him too big. And he said to me, big white star. They always said to the natives, big white star, because that's what we had on their airplane wings, and they knew they were Americans. So he had also sent some messages over. And finally, we radioed in, and between that message and this message, we set up a rescue mission. Now, Branningham, by that time, thought I was a great guy. He and I had put the first 37 millimeter anti-tank gun on the bow of a PT boat. He and I had come up with that idea. He came up with it, and I helped him do it. And he had began to think I was a pretty good guy. So he said, Robbie, would you like to go in on the rescue mission? Well, the 118 wasn't up there yet, but the 157 was going to go on the rescue mission. Now, again, a hand to how many military men in the audience? Raise your hands. If your squadron commander, whether you be in the Army, Navy, or Marines, asks you if you'd like to do something, and you're a little pissy-ass ensign, which I was at the time, it's the greatest idea in the whole freaking world, right? So I said, oh, yes, sir, I would love to go. And thank God I said yes. It's the greatest yes I ever said in my life, other than to this little lady over here who's been my wife for 63 years. She got down on her hands and knees and said, God's sakes, marry me. No, I'm only kidding, honey. But at any rate, anyway, I went in for really 3 reasons. 1, I wanted to do what Branningham asked me to do. 2, I thought it might be a little easier mission than what we were normally doing out there. And 3, I like Jack Kennedy. So I went yes, and it's the greatest yes I ever did in my life. It changed my whole life. So we went in at night. It was dangerous because the Japanese, starting with Pearl Harbor, are not very reliable about telling the truth. They didn't say, oh, we're going to attack Hawaii. They may have well set this thing up. I mean, all we knew was the coconut shell, and we got some radio messages where they put the Berkeley guy on, maybe, and they got this whole thing set up. And you are at a great disadvantage. Those of you who fought in Vietnam know you're at great disadvantage if you're out on a boat floating high in the water, and the enemy is lying in the shrubs or in the jungle waiting for you. Well, we went in and to this island and we picked Jack up. You know, Jack, wait till I tell you what he went through. But all I can say, and he was in terrible condition, but this guy was a great kidder. We became great friends. You can tell I'm kind of a kidder at times. And when we lived together later on after we were both lost our boats, and when we picked him up, he came out alone in a big native canoe to make sure it was us, because he maybe was unsure that the Japanese had intercepted the message and were dressing themselves up like Americans and were going to pick him up. But it was us, and he said, "Where in the hell have you guys been? I've been at this bus stop for a whole week now." And that was typical of Jack, and then he almost collapsed. He was starving, he was burned, he was cut up, and we picked him up, and on our boat, we sent 2 boats up there, but our boat picked him up. Now, therefore, I want you to mention, I was one of 120 men in that attack. I was the radar officer next to the commanding officer. Now I was on the boat of only 12 men, of which only 3 were officers, that picked up Jack Kennedy and were the first to talk to Jack and his crew as to what happened in the intervening week, which I was not there. Being there in, juries and accidents, they don't want to hear anybody that wasn't a witness. For everything I've said so far, I've been a witness. None of these Mommy Dearest books were ever near the place. But anyway, I was the first to talk to Lenny Tom as to what happened in that intervening week. Now, here's what they told me. They told me that destroyer, Jack was going along with his mufflers closed so that the planes would not hear him. He was circulating back and forth, desperately looking for the enemy. And the enemy got through all of us, and they unloaded their troops. Anybody want to know how Japanese unload their troops? Do they come up to a nice wharf and have a alleyway, and there's somebody singing songs to them? Hell no, they just kick the poor guys off the side if they can't swim. What the hell, who cares? Life is chief in the Orient. Anyway, they just dumped them ashore, and they were coming back from an unusual direction, from the south. And Jack was going back and forth, desperately looking, admittedly mostly to the north, but his starboard lookout in his starboard gun tub was looking where he should. Nobody was asleep. How many in this room believe that you can sleep through 25 torpedoes going off, thousands of shells, searchlights going on? It's absolutely absurd, these books people write. But at any rate, the radioman screamed a warning. Now, Jack looked up and saw this destroyer coming out of the darkness at 38 knots. They were going everything they could. They were going about 40, that's maybe 48 miles an hour, something like that, headed right for him. 2 destroyers. Now, he had to do something else at these Mommy Dearest books. He had to first make sure that wasn't a PT boat coming towards him, an American PT boat. He didn't want to fire another PT boat, and so he had to check for that. And so all that took time. And meanwhile, once he was sure it was the Japanese, it was too late, because he was going only 6 knots. His mufflers were closed, and all that carbon monoxide and fumes were backed up in those engines. And so he did what everyone in this room would have done, every Mommy Dearest book writer would have done. He shoved those throttles forward to try to somehow get the hell out of the way. And when he did, now here's what it took to open the mufflers. This is very important. The engineer would be lying down, the machinist mate running the engines would be lying down in the engine room between the engines, to hide from incoming fire. He was between the only steel on the ship, so he might save his life when everybody else would die. So we've already got the picture up here. It cut the boat neatly in half. It cut it right so the engine room where the weight was, where the torpedoes were, sunk immediately. But the bow, which had no weight at all on it other than plywood, these boats were made of 7-ply plywood. Would you like to hide from Japanese 5-inch shells behind plywood like you have in your kitchen cabinet? But at any rate, the stern sunk, and everybody, now when you were hit, and I'll let you try it tonight. If you want to try it tonight, I don't care whether you go out on Route 80 or Route 50, take your Lexus and put it athwart ships to the road at night in the darkness. Just have your engine running, idling for hours, and suddenly somebody comes at you at 38 knots, which is about 50 miles an hour, and you try to get away. See if you can do it. You'll never make it. And so Jack didn't make it. What happened? His boat, his engine turned over, and then it stalled, and then by that time the mufflers got open, and he pushed the throttles again, and it was too late. The boat was cut right in him. It would have happened to any one of us. Any one of us. There's not a PT boat guy in the world that doesn't admit that. So anyway, he was sliced in half, and if you hit on the starboard side by somebody going about 50 miles an hour, you are going to go to port through the air. You're going to go flying right out of the cockpit to the air. The two engineers were immediately drowned. They sunk with the stern. And everybody else was thrown in the water except Jack and the radioman who was standing next to him. And Jack was at the wheel, and he was hanging on to this little grip bar we have because PT boats in the Atlantic bounce right over the waves. You can see all the way underneath them. You get a lot of broken legs, broken arms, and rough water. And he was hanging on to that, and the radioman was rammed up against him. And that's where he ruined his back. He had back trouble in habit. That's the correct pronunciation. I'm from New England. But he had it happened a lot worse when he got hit in the back, and he had back trouble the rest of his life, as you know. The radioman was thrown against him, which didn't help it. And the radioman said, Mr. Kennedy, like a damn fool, then jumped into the water and swam out in the flaming gasoline that was all over the water to try to save his men. Would you or Ramami Dearest book have done that? You Republicans or whoever you are may not like the Kennedys, but at any rate, that's what he did. He pulled his men back one at a time, and Jack told me when we rescued him, the only thing that saved him is that destroyer was going so fast that the bow wake of the destroyer itself carried the flaming gasoline away from the wooden hull of the boat. That allowed him to pull his men back one at a time and hang on to the hull. Well, the next morning, they're out there hanging to the hull, and the hull is slowly drifting towards 40,000 troops on Kolomanjaro. So Jack knew that the next night he had to do something, or they would all be captured and tortured to death. So what he did the next morning, he took and ask yourself, would have you done this? He took the most severely wounded man who was terribly burned and tied his life jacket around the man and towed this man for 2.5 miles at night, the next night, through the water to try to get to some little island here where there are no Japanese. The other crew hung on to some of the wreckage and so on, and gradually they all got back. When Jack landed, he was totally and completely exhausted. He had burned. In that week, he had nothing to eat. In that whole week, he had never been able to. The only water they had was to lick the leaves of the palm trees and hope they got some bird guano that gave them some some poop invigoration and nitrogen or something, try to save him. And night after night, he went out into this passage, is what they all told me. Not just Jack told me, all his true. Night after night to try to help his men. Now, if the narrow passage between the wide ocean and a big strait, there's lots of current, lots of high waves. It's very bad in here. And so what he did night after night, including the very first night he arrived on Plum Island, and this, thanks to Julia, is Plum Island. We even have a picture. It's now called JFK Island, I understand. This is Plum Island. The most important part of this picture is not the island. It's not much bigger than a block big. It's these coral reefs. These coral reefs are everywhere in the South Pacific. They're all around these islands. They're not that old, dull coral reef stuff you have in your fishbowl. They're this coral reef stuff that's sharp, that cuts you to shreds. And so Jack had decided that the way he could save his men, he would never ask them to do it, was far too dangerous. He left them with Lenny Tom. Oh, said the Mommy Dearest books. He left his men. Oh, what a guy, leaving his men. Well, it was horribly dangerous. He didn't know each island he went to, whether there might be a outpost. Japanese, I got to be careful. Everybody's real big on that word. But anyway, he would get out here alone, and he would crawl across the reefs. The waves would hit him and knock him down. He would swallow water. He'd pass out. He did this night after night. When we picked him up, a month to the day later, I lost my boat way up here off northern La Vella. Nobody gives a damn about that. I'm only a park commissioner, for God's sake. But at any rate, I lost my boat, and they put me in the same tent with him. And I took this picture of Jack 3 months after we rescued him, when I was living in the tent with him. Look how thin he is. But by now, his feet are healed. And he's leaning on this cane that I'm using here that's going to the Smithsonian. And incidentally, he took that picture of me, and you've never seen that anyway. Now tell me, which is the cutest? Okay. Anyway, so I took that picture, and it's been all over the world. And that's going to the Smithsonian. The original of that picture is in my safe deposit bank box in the Union Bank of California on Watt Avenue here in Sacramento. That's now 100% owned by the Bank of Tokyo. Isn't that interesting? Don't get me going. Anyway, so he went night after night. Finally, they found a native canoe. And they got in the native canoe, and his third officer, Barney Ross, got in there with him. And they got out in these rough waves, and the canoe turned over, and they almost drowned. So that was worse than trying to crawl on the reefs. Anyway, that thing went on for a whole week, and we finally picked him up, and he came back. And on the trip home, when we picked up those men, one of them was dying. The rest were all burned. Kennedy was burned, not just from the gasoline, but from the sun. The sun for a whole week with no shade and so on. We finally got him home, but every time we speeded up, the men would cry and with their burns when we bounced on the waves. And we had to get home before daylight, other the Japanese dawn patrol would come out and destroy us. And we finally got him home. And Jack, they put him in a tent, and we were then in luxury headquarters. This is really luxury for us guys. We had never been in a real tent. And I mean, that's the tent. That's the little White House. And instead of having Jackie as a mate, he had me in that little place. And we were alone. I was in there. I arrived a month later. I lost my boat. And so we put him, and I was there for 2.5 months with him. Now you're down a one-on-one witness. One-on-one. Nobody in the world was Jack Kennedy's tent mate right after He had lost his boat. We had both lost our boats. We're in the same situation. No Mommy Dearest books. I never saw one of them in that tent. Just Jack and I. We talked together, and most of you know I have another speech that talks about what he was like when we were tent mates, and we're out of time to talk about that. But at any rate, we had a great talk about what actually happened, and he told me, he said, Robbie, I pushed the throttles before I opened the mufflers. I had no other chance to do anything else. But he said it wouldn't have made any difference. Now, if a Mommy Dearest guy gets that muffler story, wait till you see what they could do with that. Oh, God, yeah, well, he must have, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, we got to be great friends, and I'm going to end this story now with this. While I'm talking about whether or not he had courage, because he had written a book about courage. So did he have courage? If anybody haven't decided he had courage so far, let me tell you what happened next. He was in such bad shape, they gave him orders to go home. And he ripped them up, and he said, no, I want to go back up the line. I said, Jack, give me those damn things. I'll put my name on them. I want to go home. Would have you done that? And the last thing I'm going to tell you, because I see somebody standing up there that looks very authoritative to me. But at any rate, the last thing I'm going to tell you is Jack then was sent up here to Vella La Vella, and he was on the same island with Nixon. Nixon was the air traffic controller of the airfield we were just capturing on Vella La Vella. So we would then have 1, 2, 3 airfields, and the Japanese would only have 19. So Jack was sent up there, and I was sent to another base over here. So I wasn't here when this happened. But what happened there was finally our commanding officer said to the Marines, they said, if we take you over at night, we'll never go over here in the daytime. My God, this is 40, 50 miles open water. Come back. So we'll put you over there and get rid of that float plane base. Get rid of those bastards. They're dropping flares on us, everything. So the Marines agreed, and they sent 2 PT boats over there at night, and they put some Marines over. And at 10 o'clock the next morning, the Marine major radioed. He said, we're totally surrounded. We had no idea the Japanese had this many troops on Choiseul. Would you come and get us? And we said, fine, we'll come at night. And the Marine radioed back, then don't bother coming. There'll be none of us left. And our squadron commander asked for volunteers to go in daylight. And had I been there, I wasn't there, I was actually over there, I would have jumped behind the biggest palm tree I could find. Jack Kennedy was the only one that said, I'll go. He had enough gasoline to get over there, get 2 boatloads full of Marines on one boat, so jammed you couldn't even fire guns, and get halfway home, and then run out of gas. And all my Republican friends say, now you got it, a Democrat. They promise you money, they promise you everything, they run out of money, they run out of gas, typical. But Jack, it was his only chance. So then he had to talk somebody who didn't want to do it in the first place to tow him back the last half. Can you imagine what would happen in that towing situation? One PT boat towing another one of those Japanese planes came in. Well, for some reason, the Japanese never came out. He got those Marines home. And I'll close my story with this. Have I left any pictures on here before I close this thing? I think. Yeah, there's the tent we're in. And there's the picture I took of Jack. That's second famous picture in World War II next to the Iwo Jima picture. And there's a picture he took to me. You never seen anywhere. He's a lousy photographer. He jerked the camera, right, you camera guys? See the fuzzy? Oh, hell, he's not a good camera. Anyway, I was on Channel 3 years ago, and I told this story, and I got a phone call. I got off the TV, and they said, Commander, somebody wants to talk to you on the telephone. And somebody was talking to me, and it was an African-American. I could tell from the accent. And he was crying, and he said, I'm a disabled Marine. He says, I live in Oak Park, right here in Sacramento. And he said, I was one of those Marines. He said, I was terribly disabled and beat up and shot. and they would have to leave me for the Japanese to bayonet me to death, which is incidentally what they did to their own wounded, so they wouldn't have to be bothered with them. And he said, I had no idea, but it was a skinny guy in a PT boat. I had no idea he was the future president of the United States that rescued me. And he started to cry, and he hung up. I've never been able to trace him. And he said, thank God for a guy with guts that would do a mission like that. So you guys decide whether Jack Kennedy had courage or not. And this is my closing remarks, is that I want you to all go back tonight and read the inauguration address of any president you want. Bush, Nixon, Carter, I don't care who. Then read Jack Kennedy's. All those guys promised you everything. Look at what Obama's promised. All of them. They're going to do this for you, going to do that for you. Jack Kennedy didn't promise you one damn thing. Instead, he asked us to not ask aid from your government, your country. What is it, Lynn? Ask not what your country can do for you, what kind of handouts you can get, but what you can do for your country. And in my estimation, and the estimation of every PT boat guy that was there, is that Jack Kennedy went out and he did it himself first. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Commander.